Every morning at 7:45, the staff at Rosewood Café would feel their stomachs drop. They knew he was coming. Richard Westbrook, the millionaire real estate developer who had made it his personal mission to make their lives miserable. For 3 long years, Richard had been visiting this small neighborhood cafe, and in that time, he had turned a simple coffee shop into his personal stage for cruelty. The moment he walked through that door, everything changed. The pleasant morning chatter would die down. Customers would suddenly find their phones very interesting. And the staff, well, they would brace themselves for what was about to come. Richard wasn't just rude. That word was far too simple for what he did. He was calculated in his meanness. He studied people, found their weak spots, and then pushed every single button he could find. If a barista had a slight accent, he would mock the way they pronounced words. If someone looked tired, he would make comments about their appearance, suggesting they were too lazy to take care of themselves. His order was always the same, but the way he delivered it changed based on his mood. Sometimes he would bark it out like he was commanding soldiers. Other times he would speak so quietly that servers had to lean in close, only for him to snap at them for invading his personal space. He wanted his double espresso extra hot, with exactly 3 ice cubes served on the side. The blueberry scone had to be heated for exactly 45 seconds. Not 40, not 50, 45, and heaven help anyone who got it wrong. The cafe owner, Helen, was a kind woman in her 50s who had built this place from nothing. She knew about Richard's behavior. Everyone knew, but he spent money, lots of it. And worse, he brought other wealthy clients to the cafe. Business owners, lawyers, people who signed big checks and left generous tips. Helen felt trapped between protecting her staff and keeping her business afloat. The employees had developed their own system for dealing with Richard. Every morning they would draw straws. Short straw meant you had to serve him that day. It sounds almost funny when you say it like that, but there was nothing funny about watching your coworker's face fall when they picked that short straw. Some days the unlucky person would try to call in sick. Others would just accept their fate with the grim determination of a soldier heading into battle. Tom, the oldest barista, had been working at the cafe for 5 years. He was a gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and reading glasses that always sat crooked on his nose. Richard seemed to take special pleasure in tormenting Tom. He would criticize the way his hands shook slightly when he poured coffee, making cruel jokes about old age and incompetence. More than once, Helen had found Tom sitting in the storage room during his break, trying to compose himself with tears in his eyes. Then there was Melissa, a college student working part-time to pay for her textbooks. She was studying neuroscience, dreaming of becoming a doctor someday. But when Richard looked at her, all he saw was a waitress who wasn't moving fast enough. He had called her stupid so many times that she had started to believe it. Her confidence, which had once been bright and strong, had dimmed to almost nothing. Jamie, another server, had developed anxiety so bad that he would feel physically sick on mornings when he had to work Richard's table. He was supporting his mother, who had multiple sclerosis, working double shifts most weeks, but Richard didn't care about any of that. To Richard, they were all just servants who existed to make his life more convenient. The regular customers at Rosewood Café knew what was happening. They saw everything, but nobody said anything. There's this weird thing that happens when someone acts terribly in public. Most people just freeze. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to become the next target. So they would sit at their tables, hiding behind their laptops and newspapers, pretending they couldn't hear Richard's voice cutting through someone's dignity like a knife. Some customers had stopped coming altogether. They couldn't stomach watching the abuse anymore. But others had become numb to it, treating Richard's daily performances like background noise in their morning routine. That's perhaps the saddest part. How quickly cruelty can become normal when nobody stands up to stop it. Richard himself seemed to feed off the discomfort he created. You could see it in his eyes, the way they would light up when someone's voice would crack or when they would apologize for something that wasn't even their fault. He dressed in expensive suits, drove a luxury car, and wore a watch that cost more than most people earned in a year. But all that wealth couldn't hide what he really was. A bully who had learned that money could buy him the right to treat people like garbage. The staff had tried to fight back in small ways. They had asked Helen to ban him.
She said she couldn't afford to.
They had tried being extra nice, hoping kindness would soften him. It only made him worse. They had tried being cold and professional, giving him no reaction at all. He just pushed harder until he got the response he wanted. So they had settled into this miserable routine. Every morning someone would draw that short straw. They would paste on a professional smile, take a deep breath, and walk over to Richard's corner booth. And every morning, he would find new ways to make them feel small, worthless, and invisible. The cafe that had once been Helen's pride and joy, a warm community space where neighbors became friends, had become infected with this dark energy. It hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. New employees would start with bright smiles and enthusiasm, talking about how much they loved coffee culture and meeting people. Within a week of serving Richard, that light would start to fade. Nobody knew how to stop it. Nobody knew what to say. Richard Westbrook had money, power, and connections. He seemed untouchable, protected by the same wealth that allowed him to treat people so terribly in the first place. The staff felt powerless, trapped in a situation where speaking up could cost them their jobs. But sometimes change comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it takes just one person who hasn't learned to accept cruelty as normal, someone who still believes that standing up for what's right matters more than staying quiet and safe. That person was about to walk through the door of Rosewood Café, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning air was crisp and cool when Maya walked up to Rosewood Café for her first day of work. She had that mixture of nervousness and excitement that comes with any new beginning. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the plain black pants and white shirt that Helen had told her was the uniform. Maya was 26 years old, but she had already lived more life than many people twice her age. For the past 5 years, she had been overseas, teaching English in small rural villages where running water was a luxury, and electricity came and went like the seasons. She had worked with communities that had almost nothing, yet somehow managed to smile more than anyone she had ever met back home. But life had called her back. Her father was getting older and needed family nearby. So Maya had packed up her simple life abroad and returned to the city where she grew up. Everything felt strange now. Too fast, too loud, too focused on things that didn't really matter. She needed work while she figured out what came next, and the cafe job seemed perfect. Simple, straightforward, honest work. Helen had interviewed her just 3 days ago. The older woman had been impressed by Maya's calm energy and the way she spoke about her time working with people from all walks of life. There was something grounded about this young woman, something that suggested she wouldn't fall apart at the first sign of difficulty. Helen had hired her on the spot, telling her to come in Monday morning for training. What Helen didn't mention was Richard Westbrook. It wasn't because Helen wanted to deceive Maya. It was more complicated than that. Over the years, Helen had learned that telling new employees about Richard before they met him never helped. Words couldn't capture the reality of his behavior. New staff would either not believe it could be that bad, or they would be so anxious that they would mess up from nerves, making Richard even worse. Better to let them see for themselves. Better to let them understand that this was just part of the job. That's what Helen told herself anyway, though it never quite sat right in her conscience. Maya pushed open the cafe door, and a little bell chimed above her head. The morning rush was just starting. A few customers sat scattered at tables typing on laptops or reading newspapers. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. It reminded Maya of a cafe she used to visit in a small town in Thailand, except that place had been run by a grandmother who would give free cookies to children and always had time to listen to everyone's problems. "You must be Maya." Helen appeared from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile was genuine but tired. "Welcome to Rosewood. Come on, let me show you around." The next hour passed in a blur of information. "Here's the espresso machine. Watch out because the steam wand sticks sometimes. This is where we keep the extra cups. The pastries come from a bakery 2 blocks over, delivered fresh at 6 every morning. The register system is old but reliable. Just hit this button twice if it freezes up." Tom, the older barista, gave Maya a kind smile and showed her how he liked to arrange the workspace. Melissa, who was restocking napkins, seemed sweet but distant, like someone who had learned not to invest too much emotion in anything. Jamie was friendly but kept glancing at the clock in a way that made Maya wonder if he was expecting something. "You'll do great," Tom said, patting her shoulder gently. "Just remember the customer is always right, even when they're wrong." He said it like a joke, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he meant it more seriously than the light tone implied. Maya noticed the other staff members exchanging looks, little glances that seemed to carry conversations without words. She had seen this before in the villages where she had worked. This was the look people shared when they knew something difficult was coming, but didn't want to speak it out loud. "Is everything okay?" Maya asked, her intuition picking up on the strange energy in the room. "Everything's fine," Helen said quickly. Too quickly. "Just, morning rush can get hectic. You'll get used to the rhythm." But it wasn't the rhythm they were worried about. It was Richard. As 7:30 approached, Maya noticed the atmosphere in the cafe shift. The staff became quieter, more tense. Jamie pulled out a handful of straws from his pocket, and the others gathered around. Maya watched, confused as they each drew one. Melissa got the short straw and her face went pale. "What's that about?" Maya asked Tom. "Oh, just a silly thing we do," Tom said, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Deciding who takes certain tables." Maya didn't push it, but she filed the information away. Something was definitely going on. Helen pulled Maya aside as they prepared for the morning to fully begin. "Listen, we get all types in here. Some customers are lovely. Some are just here for their coffee fix and don't want to chat. And some are, well, particular about how they like things. Just stay professional, stay calm, and you'll be fine. If you're ever uncomfortable with a customer, come find me immediately." "Has that happened before?" Maya asked. Helen hesitated. "Just know that you're not alone here. We're a team." It was a non-answer, but Maya didn't have time to think about it because customers were starting to stream in more steadily now. She threw herself into the work, taking orders, delivering coffee, clearing tables. It felt good to be busy, to be useful. The customers were mostly pleasant, offering thank yous and please remembers that reminded her that basic courtesy still existed in the world. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was waiting for something. The other staff kept glancing at the door. Melissa, who had drawn the short straw, looked like she might be sick. And the clock kept ticking towards 7:45. Maya had no idea that in just a few minutes she would meet the man who had been terrorizing this cafe for 3 years. She had no idea that her simple first day of work was about to become something much more complicated. She had no idea that the life experiences she brought with her, the things she had seen and learned in villages halfway around the world, were about to be tested in ways she never expected. Sometimes ignorance is a gift. If Maya had known what was coming, she might have been nervous. She might have put up walls or prepared defenses. But instead, she just kept working, kept smiling at customers, kept learning the rhythm of this new place. The bell above the door was about to chime again. And when it did, everything would change. At exactly 7:45, the cafe door burst open with such force that several customers looked up in surprise. Richard Westbrook had arrived. He was already on his phone, his voice loud and aggressive as he barked orders at whoever was on the other end. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Maya earned in 3 months, perfectly tailored, not a thread out of place. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His watch caught the morning light and threw it around the room like he was trying to remind everyone exactly how expensive it was. But it was his face that told you everything you needed to know. There was no warmth there, no kindness in his eyes. He looked at the cafe the way someone might look at a public bathroom they had to use out of necessity, with disgust barely concealed behind a thin mask of tolerance. Richard didn't walk to his table. He marched like he owned the place and everyone in it. He threw himself into the corner booth with the dramatic flair of someone who wanted to be noticed, then immediately snapped his fingers. Twice. Sharp, impatient snaps that echoed in the suddenly quiet cafe. Maya, who had been restocking napkins near the counter, looked up at the sound. She wasn't sure what it meant. Where she had worked before, people didn't snap their fingers at other people. That was something you did to get a dog's attention, not a human being. "That's for you," Jamie whispered urgently, appearing at her elbow. His face had gone pale. "Good luck." "What do you mean, good luck?" Maya asked, but Jamie had already retreated behind the counter like he was hiding from something dangerous. Maya looked over at the man in the corner booth. He was still on his phone, still barking orders. She grabbed her notepad and pen, straightened her apron, and walked over with a professional smile. This was just another customer, she told herself. Just another person who wanted coffee. How wrong she was. She reached the table and opened her mouth to introduce herself. "Good morning, my name is..." Double espresso. Richard cut her off without looking up from his phone. Extra hot. 3 ice cubes on the side. Exactly 3, not 2, not 4. 1 blueberry scone heated for 45 seconds. Not 40, not 50. 45. And I need it fast because unlike you people, my time actually has value. Are we clear? Maya blinked. The words had come out like bullets, rapid fire and cold. She had never been spoken to like this before. Not even in places where she didn't speak the language well, and had accidentally insulted people through cultural misunderstandings. Yes, sir, she said, keeping her voice level. I'll get that for you right away. Wait. Richard finally looked up from his phone, and his eyes scanned her face with the cold assessment of someone examining a piece of furniture they might buy. Are you new? Yes, sir. It's my first day. Richard let out a sharp laugh that had no humor in it. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. That means you're definitely going to mess this up. Look, I don't have time for training day disasters. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly. Actually, on second thought, you probably will anyway. Just try to minimize the damage. Around the cafe, conversations had stopped. Other customers were pretending to look at their phones or out the window, but Maya could feel their attention. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen. She felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her professional smile in place. I'll do my best, sir. Your best is probably not very good, but I suppose it'll have to do. Now go. You're wasting my time just standing there. Maya walked back to the counter, her mind spinning. Tom was already preparing the espresso, having heard the entire order. He worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this exact drink hundreds of times. Don't take it personally, Tom said quietly, his hands moving over the machine. He's like that with everyone, especially new people. How long has he been coming here? Maya asked. 3 years, Melissa said from nearby, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 long years. Maya watched Tom prepare the drink with extraordinary care. The temperature was checked twice. The ice cubes were counted and recounted. The scone was placed in the warmer, and Tom stood watching the timer like he was defusing a bomb. 45 seconds exactly. Why does everyone put up with him? Maya asked. The question hung in the air. Tom and Melissa exchanged a look. Because Helen says we have to, Melissa finally answered. Because he spends money. Because he brings other rich customers. Because standing up to people like him costs more than staying quiet. Tom placed the espresso and scone on a tray with hands that trembled slightly. Maya noticed the tremor and wondered how many times Tom had delivered this order. How many insults he had endured over 3 years. I'll take it, Maya said. She carried the tray back to Richard's table and placed each item carefully in front of him. The espresso was positioned exactly in the center, the 3 ice cubes in a small dish to the side. The scone was plated beautifully, still steaming slightly from being warmed. Here you are, sir, Maya said politely. Richard didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that she was there. He grabbed the espresso cup and took a long sip. Then his face twisted in disgust and he slammed the cup down so hard that coffee sloshed out onto the saucer and the table. This is lukewarm garbage, he shouted loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. Did you even try? Are you completely incompetent? Maya's jaw tightened. Sir, you requested extra hot with ice cubes on the side. The ice is meant to cool the coffee to your preferred temperature. Richard's face turned red. Don't you dare tell me what I meant. Don't you stand there and act like you know better than me. I know what I ordered and this is not it. Make it again, and this time engage whatever minimal brain cells you possess. The cafe had gone completely silent. Maya could feel every eye on her, could sense everyone holding their breath. This was a test, she realized, not just of her ability to handle a difficult customer, but of something bigger. This man had been doing this for 3 years. 3 years of treating people like they were nothing. 3 years of nobody stopping him. Maya picked up the cup without saying a word. She walked back to the counter where Tom was already reaching for the espresso machine. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Make it exactly the same, Tom said quietly. He does this every time. It doesn't matter if it's perfect. He just likes making people feel small. Maya looked back at Richard, who had returned to his phone like nothing had happened. She looked around at the other staff, all of them wearing the same expression of weary acceptance. She thought about the villages she had worked in, where people had so little but treated each other with such dignity. And here was this man who had everything money could buy, using his wealth as a weapon to hurt people who were just trying to earn a living. Something hardened in Maya's chest, a determination that she hadn't felt in a long time, but she said nothing. Not yet. She knew better than to react on her first day. Instead, she watched and she learned. She saw how Richard operated, how he fed on fear and submission, and she began to understand exactly what kind of battle she had walked into. The rest of Maya's first day passed in a strange blur. After that initial encounter with Richard, she watched him sit in his corner booth for another hour, making phone calls and sending emails, completely unbothered by the scene he had created. When he finally left, he walked out without a word, leaving a $20 bill on the table for an $8 order. Not out of generosity, Maya would learn, but because it gave him the illusion that his cruelty was somehow balanced by his money. As the door closed behind him, the entire cafe seemed to exhale. Conversations resumed. Customers who had been rigid in their seats relaxed. The staff gathered near the counter and Maya saw the same exhausted relief on all their faces. "You handled that well," Helen said, appearing from the back office where she had watched the entire thing. "First day and you already survived Richard Westbrook. Is it always like that?" Maya asked. "Usually worse," Melissa admitted. "You got the light version because you're new. He was almost testing you. Wait until he really gets going." Maya went home that evening feeling unsettled. She had worked in difficult conditions before. She had dealt with language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and genuine emergencies. But this felt different. This was cruelty for cruelty's sake, and everyone just accepted it as normal. The next morning, Richard arrived at 7:45 sharp. This time Maya was ready for him. She had volunteered to take his table, which had surprised the other staff members. Nobody volunteered for Richard duty. He ordered the same thing. Double espresso, extra hot, 3 ice cubes, blueberry scone heated 45 seconds. Maya delivered it perfectly. He found fault with it anyway. The espresso was too hot. Then it was too cold. The scone was dry. Then it was too moist. Nothing was ever right. But what struck Maya more than the complaints was the pattern. Richard wasn't just rude to her. He was rude to everyone, but in specific, calculated ways. He seemed to study each person, finding their particular vulnerability and pushing on it until something cracked. With Tom, he focused on age. "Those old hands shaking again, Tom? Maybe it's time to retire before you hurt someone." Tom's hands would tremble more after comments like that, which only gave Richard more ammunition. With Melissa, he attacked her intelligence. Community college, right? Couldn't get into a real university. Melissa had mentioned once that she was studying neuroscience, and Richard had somehow twisted that into a weapon. She had stopped talking about her dreams after he mocked them one too many times. With Jamie, Richard went after his appearance. Jamie was a bit overweight, something he was self-conscious about, and Richard noticed. "Sampling too much of the product, Jamie. Maybe stick to black coffee." Jamie had started skipping lunch after that comment, which worried the rest of the staff. Maya watched all of this over the course of her first week. She saw how Richard's abuse was surgical, precise. He knew exactly where to cut to make it hurt the most. And the worst part was how it changed people. Tom, who had once been confident and cheerful, now second-guessed every drink he made. Melissa, who had been passionate about her studies, now spoke in uncertain whispers. Jamie had developed dark circles under his eyes from stress. On her third day, Maya tried killing Richard with kindness. She smiled brighter, complimented his suit, tried to engage him in pleasant conversation. He responded by telling her that her fake cheerfulness was transparent and pathetic, and that if she spent less time trying to be liked and more time doing her job properly, maybe she wouldn't be working at a cafe in her 20s. On her fourth day, she tried being purely professional. No smiles, no extra words, just efficient service. He called her robotic and soulless, saying that people without personality shouldn't work in customer service. There was no winning with Richard Westbrook. That was the point. He wasn't looking for good service or proper coffee. He was looking for opportunities to make people feel inferior to him. On Friday morning, Maya's 5th day, things escalated. Richard arrived in an even fouler mood than usual. His phone conversation as he entered was loud and aggressive. Something about a deal falling through, about incompetent people ruining everything. He was already angry when he sat down and he needed someone to take it out on. Maya delivered his usual order, prepared with the same meticulous care that Tom had taught her. She placed it on the table gently, professionally. Richard looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before his hand shot out and swept the espresso cup off the table. The cup shattered on the floor with a crash that made everyone in the cafe jump. Hot coffee sprayed across the tiles, dark liquid spreading in every direction. The sound of ceramic breaking seemed to echo longer than it should have, like the universe itself was holding its breath. Richard leaned back in his booth, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "Looks like you placed it too close to the edge. Clumsy of you. Better clean that up. It's probably the most valuable thing you'll touch all day, maybe all year." The cafe had gone silent again. This was a new level even for Richard. Breaking things, creating messes. That was crossing a line from verbal abuse into something that felt almost violent. Maya stood perfectly still, looking down at the shattered cup and spreading coffee. She could feel everyone watching her, waiting to see how she would react. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. She thought about all the times she had bitten her tongue this week, all the insults she had absorbed, all the cruelty she had witnessed. She thought about Tom, whose hands shook. About Melissa, who had stopped believing in herself. About Jamie, who was literally making himself sick from stress. She thought about all the customers who sat silently, watching this happen day after day and doing nothing. And she thought about a conversation she had once had with an elderly woman in a small village in Nepal. The woman had very little, lived in a house with dirt floors and no running water, but she had said something that stuck with Maya forever. The poorest person in the world is not the one without money. It's the one without kindness in their heart. Maya reached down and picked up the largest piece of the broken cup. Then she did something that surprised everyone in the cafe, including herself. Instead of immediately kneeling to clean up the mess, instead of apologizing or hurrying to fetch cleaning supplies, she pulled out the chair across from Richard and sat down. She sat down at his table. She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, Richard Westbrook looked genuinely surprised. The entire cafe seemed to freeze. Customers stopped mid-sip. The espresso machine's hiss sounded impossibly loud in the silence. Tom's hand was frozen halfway to a cup. Melissa had stopped breathing altogether. Maya held Richard's gaze with a calm intensity that made his smug smile falter. She didn't speak immediately. She just sat there looking at him, really seeing him, not as a wealthy customer or a source of tips, but as what he really was underneath all that expensive clothing and aggressive posturing. "Mr. Westbrook," Maya finally said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry through the entire cafe, "I think we need to have a conversation." Richard's face cycled through confusion, then outrage. His mouth opened to say something cutting, something designed to put her back in her place. But something in Maya's expression stopped him. There was no fear there, no submission. Just a clear, direct honesty that he hadn't encountered in this cafe before. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard Westbrook didn't know what to say. Maya continued to hold Richard's gaze completely unafraid. The coffee was still spreading across the floor at her feet, the broken ceramic catching the morning light, but she didn't look away from him for even a second. "I've been working here for 5 days now," Maya began, her voice conversational but firm. "And in those 5 days I've noticed something very interesting about you, Mr. Westbrook." Richard's face was turning red, that familiar color that usually preceded one of his verbal explosions. "How dare you sit at my— You come here every single morning," Maya continued, speaking over him in a way that made his eyes widen with shock. Nobody interrupted Richard Westbrook. "Every morning at exactly 7:45. Always alone. And you spend your time here trying desperately to prove that you're better than everyone around you." "I don't have to listen to this," Richard sputtered. But he hadn't moved. Something about Maya's calm energy had him pinned in his seat. "You don't have to listen," Maya agreed. "You could leave right now. But you won't, because this is what you do every morning. This is your routine. And I've been wondering why a wealthy, successful man would choose to spend his mornings in a small cafe, insulting people who are just trying to do their jobs." Around them, the cafe remained frozen. Several customers had their phones out now, though they were trying to be discreet about it. Helen had emerged from the back office, her hand over her mouth. Tom, Melissa, and Jamie were clustered behind the counter watching with wide eyes. You have no idea who you're talking to, Richard said, but his voice had lost some of its usual venom. He sounded more confused than angry now, like he was watching a script he had memorized suddenly change without warning. I know exactly who I'm talking to, Maya said softly. Before I came here, I spent 5 years teaching in small villages overseas, places where people lived on a few dollars a day, where running water was a luxury and electricity was unreliable. And you know what I learned there? Richard didn't answer, just stared at her. I learned that there are 2 types of people in this world. There are those who are secure in themselves, who know their own worth, and they never feel the need to make others feel small. And then there are those who are so deeply insecure, so uncertain of their own value, that they need to constantly tear other people down just to feel okay about themselves. I'm not insecure, Richard said, but the words came out defensive, almost childlike, aren't you? Maya tilted her head slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, you look like the most insecure person I've ever met. You have money, clearly. Nice clothes, expensive watch, luxury car I've seen you drive. But you come here every day to bully people who can't fight back. Why, I don't bully anyone. I simply expect quality service. Tom has worked here for 5 years, Maya said, gesturing toward the older barista. He raised 3 children alone after his wife died. He volunteers at a homeless shelter twice a week. He makes your coffee with more care and precision than you probably put into anything you do, and you reduced him to tears by mocking his age. Tom's eyes were glistening, but he stood straighter now, something like pride mixing with his emotion. Melissa is studying neuroscience on a full scholarship, Maya continued. She's brilliant, probably smarter than either of us, and she's working here to pay for her textbooks because she doesn't come from money. And you've spent weeks making her doubt her own intelligence. Melissa's hand went to her mouth, a tear sliding down her cheek. Jamie is supporting his mother, who has a chronic illness. He works double shifts most weeks and still manages to smile at customers. And you mock his appearance because that's the only power you think you have. Jamie straightened up, his jaw set with an emotion that looked like years of suppressed anger, finally finding validation. So no, Mr. Westbrook, you don't expect quality service. You expect submission. You expect people to absorb your cruelty and thank you for the privilege because you leave cash on the table. The red in Richard's face had deepened, but now it looked less like anger and more like shame. His hands, which had been spread on the table in a position of dominance, had curled into fists, but not threatening ones. Defensive ones. You don't know anything about me, he said, but his voice had gone quiet. You're right, I don't, Maya acknowledged. I don't know what made you this way. I don't know what happened in your life that taught you that kindness is weakness and that other people are just targets for your pain. But I do know this. Whatever wound you're nursing, whatever hurt you're carrying, you're trying to heal it by hurting other people. And it's not working, is it? Richard's jaw worked silently. His eyes had taken on a glassy quality. If it was working, you wouldn't come back here every day, Maya said gently. If making people feel small actually made you feel bigger, you would have moved on by now. Found new victims. But you keep coming back to the same place, to the same people, like you're searching for something you can't name. I come here for the coffee, Richard said, but it sounded hollow even to him. No, you don't. The coffee is good. But there are 100 cafes in this city with good coffee. You come here because this is the only place where people have to interact with you. You've decided that if you can't be loved, you'll settle for being feared. At least fear is a reaction. At least it proves you exist. The silence in the cafe was so complete that Maya could hear someone's coffee slowly dripping through a filter behind the counter. I think you're lonely, Mr. Westbrook, Maya said, and her voice carried genuine compassion now. Not pity, but real human understanding. I think you're so lonely that even negative attention feels better than being invisible. But here's what I learned in those villages where people had nothing. Wealth without kindness is just poverty wearing expensive clothes. Richard's hands were shaking now, actually trembling on the table in front of him. His eyes were moving rapidly, like he was trying to find something to focus on, some way to regain control of this situation that had slipped entirely out of his grasp. Every person in this cafe has worth, Maya said, her voice growing stronger. Tom has worth. Melissa has worth. Jamie has worth. Every customer who has sat here silently watching you abuse people has worth. And believe it or not, you have worth too. But not because of your bank account or your watch or your car. You have worth because you're a human being. We all do. That's the thing you seem to have forgotten. Stop, Richard said. but it came out as barely more than a whisper. The saddest part is that you could walk into this cafe every morning and make friends. Real friends. People who actually care about you, not your money. Tom would tell you stories that would make you laugh. Melissa would share her dreams with you if you asked nicely. Jamie would probably invite you to meet his mother. But instead you chose this. You chose cruelty, and now you're trapped in it. Richard's breathing had become labored. His face had gone from red to pale and a muscle twitched in his jaw. So here's my question for you, Mr. Westbrook, Maya said, leaning forward slightly. Is this really who you want to be? When you go home at night and look in the mirror, are you proud of the person looking back at you? Because I don't think you are. I think you're ashamed, and that shame is eating you alive, and you don't know how to stop it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire cafe seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for Richard's response. Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. His hands, which had been trembling, were now gripping the edge of the table so hard that his knuckles had gone white. The powerful, commanding presence that usually filled the room had collapsed in on itself, leaving behind something much smaller and more fragile. Maya could see it in his eyes now. Behind the anger, behind the cruelty, there was something broken. Something that had been broken for a very long time. I could destroy you, Richard finally managed to say, but the words had no force behind them. They sounded automatic, like a defense mechanism that no longer worked but still activated out of habit. I could have you fired. I could ruin this cafe. I have connections, money, power. I know you do, Maya said simply. And if using those things to hurt people who spoke honestly to you makes you feel better, then go ahead. But that would just prove my point, wouldn't it? Richard's jaw clenched so tight that Maya could see the muscles working in his neck. For a moment, she wondered if she had pushed too far, if all of this was going to blow up in her face. Getting fired from her first week at a new job wasn't exactly what she had planned, but something had shifted in Richard's expression. The rage that usually burned in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing himself clearly for the first time in years and he didn't like what he was seeing. You think you understand me? Richard said, his voice rough and unsteady. You think 5 days of serving me coffee makes you an expert on my life. I don't think I understand you, Maya replied honestly. I don't know your story. I don't know what pain you're carrying or what made you into this person. But I do understand what I see. And what I see is someone using wealth and power as a shield to keep people away while simultaneously, desperately wanting someone to notice him. That's not, Richard started, but his voice cracked. When was the last time someone was kind to you without wanting something? Maya asked softly. When was the last time you had a conversation where you weren't performing, where you weren't trying to prove something or establish dominance? When was the last time you felt genuinely connected to another human being? The questions hit Richard like physical blows. He actually flinched, his whole body recoiling as if Maya had struck him. His breathing had become shallow, and his eyes were darting around the cafe looking at all the faces watching him, really seeing them for perhaps the first time. Tom, with his kind eyes and trembling hands. Melissa, young and brilliant and broken down by months of cruelty. Jamie, exhausted and stressed but still showing up every day. Helen standing near the counter with tears streaming silently down her face. And all the customers, the witnesses to 3 years of abuse, finally seeing justice spoken aloud. Richard started, then stopped. I didn't mean to, but he had meant to. That was the thing. Every insult, every cruel comment, every deliberate attempt to make someone feel worthless had been intentional. You don't accidentally mock someone's age or weight or intelligence. You don't accidentally sweep coffee cups off tables. Those were choices, conscious decisions to inflict pain. The question isn't whether you meant to, Maya said gently. The question is why. And more importantly, the question is what you're going to do now. Richard's hands slowly released their death grip on the table. He looked down at them like he didn't recognize them, like they belonged to someone else. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I don't know how to be different. It was perhaps the most honest thing Richard Westbrook had said in years, maybe in decades. The admission seemed to cost him something, like each word was a piece of armor being removed, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Maya felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't victory exactly. It was something more complicated. She had broken through Richard's defenses, had forced him to see himself clearly, but now what? What do you do with a bully who suddenly realizes he's been a bully? Maybe you start by apologizing, Maya suggested. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Apologize? To everyone here. To Tom, Melissa, and Jamie especially. To Helen for making her cafe a place of stress instead of community. To all the customers who had to watch your behavior and felt powerless to stop it. I can't. Richard's voice was panicked now. I don't. You can, Maya said firmly. It won't fix everything. It won't undo 3 years of hurt. But it would be a start. It would be you choosing right now to be different than you've been. Richard looked around the cafe again. Every eye was on him. There was no escaping this moment. No phone call he could make that would save him. No amount of money he could throw at the situation to make it go away. For the first time in probably his entire adult life, Richard Westbrook was powerless. And maybe that was exactly what he needed to be. He started, then stopped, then started again. I'm sorry. The words came out strangled, forced, like they had to fight their way past years of pride and ego. But they came out. Tom, Richard said, turning to look at the older barista, I'm sorry for mocking your age, for making your hands shake, for making you cry. You didn't deserve that. Tom's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded slowly. Melissa, Richard continued, his voice growing slightly stronger, I'm sorry for attacking your intelligence, for making you doubt yourself. You're clearly brilliant, and I was threatened by that. Melissa covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming freely now. Jamie, I'm sorry for the comments about your weight, for adding stress to a life that already had too much of it. You work harder than I ever have. And I had no right to treat you that way. Jamie nodded, unable to speak. Helen, I'm sorry for making your cafe a place of tension and fear, instead of the community space you built it to be. Helen was openly sobbing now, decades of suppressed emotion finally finding release. And to everyone else, Richard said, his voice cracking as he addressed the whole cafe. To everyone who witnessed my behavior and had to sit in silence, I'm sorry. I've been broken for a long time, and I took that brokenness out on all of you. That was wrong. There's no excuse for it. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one was softer, more fragile, filled with the weight of 3 years finally being acknowledged. Richard stood up slowly, like a much older man than he was. He reached into his wallet and pulled out several bills, far more than necessary, and placed them on the table. But this time it felt different. Not like payment for the right to abuse people, but like the inadequate offering of someone who knew no amount of money could fix what he had done. I won't come back here, Richard said quietly. I understand that my presence would just be a reminder of pain. But I want you to know that I heard what you said, Maya. All of it. And I'm going to try to be different. He walked toward the door, his usual confident stride replaced with something uncertain and hesitant. As his hand reached for the handle, Maya spoke up one more time. Mr. Westbrook? He turned back, his expression vulnerable in a way that made him look almost like a different person. Being different takes practice, Maya said. It's not a one-time decision. It's a choice you make every day, in every interaction, and it's hard, especially when you've spent years building walls, but it's possible. I've seen it happen in people who had every reason to stay cruel, and they chose kindness instead. Richard nodded slowly, something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. Then he pushed through the door and disappeared into the morning light. The moment he was gone, the cafe erupted. Not in cheers or celebration, but in a collective release of tension that had been building for 3 years. People started talking all at once, their voices overlapping in a cascade of emotion and relief. Helen rushed over to Maya and pulled her into a fierce hug. I should have done that years ago, she sobbed. I should have protected my staff. I was a coward. You were doing what you thought you had to do, Maya said, hugging her back. We all do that sometimes. Tom, Melissa, and Jamie surrounded them, and suddenly Maya was at the center of a group hug, all of them crying and laughing at the same time. Customers were applauding, some of them coming over to thank Maya personally, apologizing for their own silence over the years. It was overwhelming and beautiful and messy, which is how real human moments always are, not neat or clean or simple, but complicated and emotional and absolutely real. Maya finally managed to extract herself from the group and knelt down to clean up the spilled coffee that had started everything. As she wiped up the mess, she thought about Richard Westbrook walking out that door, carrying the weight of 3 years of cruelty and the slim possibility of redemption. She hoped he would change. She really did. But she also knew that the most important thing wasn't whether Richard changed. It was that everyone in this cafe now knew that silence in the face of cruelty wasn't the only option. That speaking up was possible. That dignity mattered for everyone. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept that cruelty is normal. The day after Richard's departure from Rosewood Café passed in a strange daze. The staff kept expecting him to walk through the door at 7:45, bracing themselves for some new form of revenge or retaliation. But the clock ticked past his usual time and the door remained closed. He didn't come. The atmosphere in the cafe was different now, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that nobody had fully realized they were carrying. Tom's hands were steadier. Melissa smiled more easily. Jamie seemed to breathe deeper, like his lungs finally had room to expand. But the changes went beyond just the immediate staff. Regular customers who had witnessed the confrontation began staying longer, actually engaging in conversations rather than hiding behind their laptops. A woman named Patricia, who had been coming to the cafe for 2 years, approached Maya during her shift. "I'm ashamed," Patricia said simply. "I watched him abuse you and everyone else for so long and I never said anything. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't want to cause trouble. But silence is its own kind of cruelty, isn't it?" Maya saw genuine regret in the woman's eyes. "You're here now," she said. "That matters," Patricia nodded, tears threatening. "I work in corporate law. I face down aggressive executives all the time. But somehow watching it happen in a coffee shop, I just froze. I think I convinced myself that someone else would handle it, that it wasn't my responsibility." "A lot of people do that," Maya said gently. "It's easier to look away than to get involved. But we all have more power than we think we do." This conversation was repeated in different variations over the next several days. Customers who had been silent witnesses for months or years came forward to apologize, to thank Maya, to express their own shame at not speaking up sooner. The cafe became a space for collective healing, for acknowledging complicity and recommitting to standing up for what's right. Helen called a staff meeting at the end of that first week. She gathered everyone together after closing time, and for the first time in the 3 years since Richard had started coming, she addressed what had happened directly. "I failed you all," Helen began, her voice thick with emotion. "As the owner of this cafe, it was my responsibility to create a safe workplace. And I didn't. I let money and fear guide my decisions instead of doing what was right." "Helen, you don't have to," Tom started, but she held up a hand. "I do," she insisted, "because if I don't acknowledge it, then I haven't learned anything." Maya, who had been here 5 days, did what I should have done 3 years ago. She stood up to protect her co-workers, and she risked her job to do it. That should never have fallen on her shoulders. Helen looked around at her staff, people she had worked with for years, people whose tears and stress she had witnessed and accepted as the cost of doing business. "From now on, things change," Helen declared. "No customer, no matter how much money they spend, has the right to abuse anyone who works here. If someone is being disrespectful or cruel, we address it immediately. And if they don't stop, they leave. No exceptions." The relief in the room was palpable. Melissa started crying again, but these were different tears. Tears of release, of validation, of feeling protected for the first time in a long time. "I'm also instituting a new policy," Helen continued. "We're putting up a sign that says, 'We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who treats our staff disrespectfully.' And I'm raising everyone's wages by $2 an hour, starting immediately. It won't make up for what you've endured, but it's a start." The staff meeting turned into something of a group therapy session, with everyone sharing their experiences with Richard and with difficult customers in general. They talked about the times they had gone home and cried, the nights they couldn't sleep because of something cruel that had been said, the way the stress had bled into their personal lives. But they also talked about resilience, about the bonds they had formed through shared difficulty, about the small kindnesses they had shown each other that had kept them going. Meanwhile, word about what had happened at Rosewood Café was spreading through the neighborhood. In the age of social media, several customers who had been present during Maya's confrontation with Richard had recorded parts of it on their phones. The videos had gone viral locally, sparking conversations about workplace dignity, customer behavior, and the courage it takes to speak truth to power. The cafe's business actually increased. People came specifically because they had heard about the waitress who had stood up to the bully. They wanted to support a business that valued its workers. They wanted to meet Maya and tell her their own stories of workplace abuse, of customers who had gone too far, of times they wished they had spoken up but hadn't. Maya found herself becoming a reluctant symbol of something bigger than just one confrontation in one cafe. Local news stations reached out for interviews. A podcast about workplace issues wanted her to be a guest. Other service workers from around the city sent messages thanking her for saying what they had all felt, but never been allowed to express. She declined most of the attention. This wasn't about becoming famous or being celebrated. It was simply about treating people with basic human dignity, something that should be normal, not heroic. But she did agree to speak at a meeting of the local Restaurant Workers Association. Standing in front of a room full of servers, baristas, and kitchen staff, Maya shared what she had learned. The thing about bullies, she said, is that they rely on silence. They rely on people being too afraid or too tired or too worried about money to stand up to them. And as long as we stay silent, as long as we accept cruelty as just part of the job, nothing changes. She looked around at the faces in the audience, saw the recognition there, the exhaustion of people who had their own stories of customers who went too far. But here's what I learned from working in places where people had almost nothing, Maya continued. Dignity isn't something that can be bought or sold. It's not dependent on your bank account or your job title. Every human being deserves to be treated with respect. And when we accept less than that, when we tell ourselves that abuse is just the price of a paycheck, we lose a piece of ourselves. There were nods around the room, people wiping their eyes. I'm not saying it's easy to speak up, Maya added. I'm not saying there's no risk. I could have been fired. The cafe could have lost business. Richard could have retaliated in any number of ways. But sometimes the cost of staying silent is higher than the cost of speaking truth. After the meeting, Maya was surrounded by workers sharing their stories. A young man who worked at an upscale restaurant talked about a regular customer who sexually harassed the female staff. A barista from across town described a woman who threw hot coffee at her because it had too much foam. A delivery driver talked about customers who refused to tip and then complained about slow service. Each story was a variation on the same theme: people with power or money using service workers as outlets for their frustration, their anger, their need to feel superior, and workers who felt trapped, unable to defend themselves without risking their livelihoods. What you did matters, the young restaurant server told Maya. It gives the rest of us permission to believe that we don't have to accept this, that our dignity matters too. Maya thought about Richard Westbrook walking out of the cafe that day, broken and exposed and perhaps, just perhaps, on the edge of becoming something different. She wondered where he was now, whether he was keeping his promise to change or whether he had simply found a new cafe, new victims, new ways to make himself feel powerful by making others feel small. She hoped for the former. She really did. Because the point wasn't to destroy Richard or to get revenge. The point was to hold up a mirror and say, this is what you're doing and it's not okay, and you have the power to choose differently. Whether he actually chose differently was up to him. But Maya had done her part. She had spoken the truth clearly and directly, without cruelty but also without backing down. And in doing so, she had shown everyone else in that cafe that speaking up was possible. That's how change happens. Not in big dramatic moments necessarily, but in the accumulation of small acts of courage. One person standing up, which gives another person the courage to stand up, which creates a shift in what's considered acceptable, which gradually changes the culture. Rosewood Café wasn't perfect now. They still had difficult customers occasionally. There were still bad days and frustrations, but the baseline had shifted. Everyone knew now that abuse wouldn't be tolerated, that their dignity mattered, that they had the owner's support if they needed to set boundaries with customers. And that made all the difference. 3 months passed before anyone at Rosewood Café heard anything about Richard Westbrook again. Maya had almost stopped thinking about him. Her life had settled into a comfortable rhythm at the cafe. She had become close friends with Tom, Melissa, and Jamie. They would sometimes meet after shifts, sharing meals and stories. building the kind of genuine connections that Richard had probably never experienced in his entire life. The cafe itself had transformed into what Helen had always dreamed it would be, a true community space. The new policy about respecting staff was displayed prominently near the entrance, and Helen had actually enforced it twice, asking customers to leave when they became rude or aggressive. Each time, the rest of the customers had applauded. Then one morning, about a week before Thanksgiving, Helen received a letter. It was on expensive stationery, the kind that probably cost more than most people spent on a week's groceries. Inside was a handwritten note from Richard Westbrook. Helen read it first, her hand going to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Then she gathered the staff together in the back room and read it aloud. "Dear Helen and the staff of Rosewood Café," it began. "I've started this letter at least 50 times over the past 3 months. Each time the words felt inadequate, performative, like I was trying to buy forgiveness with the right combination of phrases. So I'll just tell you the truth." Helen's voice wavered as she continued reading. "After I left your cafe that day, I went home and looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked for the first time in years. And Maya was right. I was ashamed. I barely recognized the person looking back at me." Maya felt her throat tighten. The others were listening in complete silence. "I want you to know that I've started seeing a therapist," the letter continued. "Something I should have done decades ago. We're working through some difficult things, patterns that started in my childhood and calcified into the person I became. I'm not sharing this as an excuse. Nothing excuses how I treated all of you. But I'm trying to understand how I got to that place so I can ensure I never go back there." Tom was crying now, silent tears rolling down his weathered face. "I've also been volunteering at a community center, serving food to people experiencing homelessness. I know how that sounds, like I'm trying to earn redemption points or perform goodness for an audience. But it's teaching me something important, that every person has inherent worth regardless of their circumstances. That dignity isn't earned through wealth or status, but exists simply because we're human." Richard's letter went on to describe specific changes he was making in his business practices too. He had started a program to give his employees better benefits. He had apologized to several people he had treated poorly over the years. He had donated a significant amount to organizations that supported service workers' rights. "I know that none of this erases what I did," the letter concluded. "I know that my apologies don't undo the tears I caused or the stress I created. But I want you to know that Maya's words changed something in me. She held up a mirror when everyone else had given up on me, and she did it with honesty but also with compassion. She saw my humanity even when I had forgotten it existed." Helen's voice broke as she read the final paragraph. "I won't ask to come back to your cafe. I understand that my presence would be a reminder of pain, not a symbol of change. But I hope someday you'll hear that Richard Westbrook became someone different, someone better, someone who treats people with the kindness and respect that everyone deserves. Thank you for tolerating me when you shouldn't have had to, and thank you, Maya, for refusing to." There was a long silence after Helen finished reading. Then Melissa spoke up, her voice small. "Do you think he means it?" "I don't know," Maya said honestly. "Change is complicated. It's not linear. He might have good days and bad days. He might slip back into old patterns sometimes, but the fact that he's trying, that he's doing the work, that matters. Part of me wants to believe him," Tom said, wiping his eyes. "Part of me wants to think that people can change, that no one is beyond redemption." "People can change," Maya said. "I've seen it happen. But it takes work, real work, not just words. It sounds like Richard is doing that work. Whether he sustains it, whether he becomes someone genuinely different, only time will tell." Jamie, who had been quiet through the whole reading, finally spoke. "I think I needed to hear this. Not because Richard deserves forgiveness or because we owe him anything, but because I needed to believe that speaking up can actually make a difference, that cruelty doesn't have to be permanent." Helen folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. "I'm going to keep this," she said, "as a reminder of what we went through, of what we survived, and of what we learned." In the weeks that followed, rumors filtered back through the business community about Richard Westbrook. Some people said he had changed completely, that he was like a different person. Others said they didn't see much difference. A few mentioned that he still had a sharp edge but seemed to be working on tempering it. The truth, Maya thought, was probably somewhere in the middle. Richard was probably still struggling, still fighting against decades of ingrained behavior. But he was fighting, and that was something. One afternoon, about a month after the letter arrived, An older woman came into Rosewood Café. She ordered a simple coffee and a croissant, then sat at a table near the window. When Maya brought over her order, the woman smiled warmly. "You're Maya, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Maya replied, slightly confused. "I'm Richard Westbrook's mother," the woman said gently. "I hope it's okay that I came. I just wanted to thank you personally." Maya sat down across from her, too surprised to maintain her usual professional distance. "I didn't know my son had become that person," Richard's mother continued, her eyes glistening. "He kept that part of his life very separate. But after what happened here, he came to me. He told me everything, and for the first time in years we had an honest conversation about who he had become and why." She took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. Richard's father was a difficult man, demanding, critical, impossible to please. He taught Richard that the world was divided into winners and losers, and that being kind was a weakness. When his father died 5 years ago, instead of freeing Richard from that mindset, it somehow made it worse. He doubled down on it like he was proving something to a ghost. "I'm sorry," Maya said softly. "Don't be. I'm not telling you this to make excuses for him. What he did to you and your coworkers was inexcusable. I'm telling you because I want you to know that your words reached him in a way that nothing else could. You saw through all his defenses and spoke to something human underneath, and that started a process of healing that was long overdue." Richard's mother reached across the table and took Maya's hand. "My son has a long way to go. He's carrying decades of pain and dysfunction, and it won't be fixed overnight. But he's trying, really trying, and that's because you cared enough to be honest with him. You didn't just accept his cruelty as unchangeable. You believed he could be better, and you told him so." After Richard's mother left, Maya stood at the window watching the street outside. People hurried past wrapped in coats against the cold, each carrying their own stories, their own pain, their own potential for change. She thought about the villages where she had worked, where people had so little but somehow managed to hold on to their humanity. She thought about the wealthy neighborhoods where people had everything except peace of mind. She thought about how money could insulate you from so many problems but couldn't protect you from yourself. The door chimed, and a new customer walked in. Maya turned with a smile, ready to take their order. This was her job now, this small cafe in a busy city. It wasn't exotic or adventurous like her previous work, but in its own way it was just as important. Because change doesn't always happen in dramatic moments or faraway places. Sometimes it happens in a coffee shop on an ordinary morning when someone decides that enough is enough. When someone looks at cruelty and refuses to accept it as normal. When someone sees the humanity in a bully and calls it forth, demanding that person be better. The other staff members had changed too. Tom stood taller now, his hands steady and sure. Melissa talked openly about her dreams of medical school, her confidence rebuilt. Jamie had started eating regular meals again, and had even started dating someone who worked at the bookstore next door. And Helen, perhaps most of all, had transformed. She no longer saw her staff as just employees but as people under her protection. She had become fierce in defending them, creating a workplace where dignity wasn't negotiable. The viral videos from that morning had long since faded from social media, replaced by newer dramas and different stories. But the impact of what happened at Rosewood Café continued to ripple outward. Other service workers had started speaking up in their own workplaces. Other owners had implemented similar policies protecting their staff. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. That evening, as Maya locked up the cafe, she paused to look at the sign Helen had put up. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who treats our staff disrespectfully." Simple words, but they represented a profound shift in thinking. They said, "Our workers are people and their dignity matters more than your money."